This week on Waterways, the effects from the 2010 cold front and Tamiami Trail reconstruction. January 11th, 2010. Water temperatures in Florida Bay register 41 degrees Fahrenheit. The coastal mangrove zone of Florida Bay shows temperature readings as low as 34 degrees Fahrenheit. The result? Millions of fish dead. This is the largest fish kill resulting from cold weather to hit South Florida in more than 30 years.
The bayside shorelines of the Upper Keys here were just filled, covered with dead fish. Within Everglades National Park, some of the shallow basins north of Flamingo was where a lot of the fish were seen. The boat basin at Flamingo, I estimated close to a little under 5,000 dead snook and tarpon alone in the boat basin at Flamingo. In one backcountry lake alone, where I did a detailed count, this is just north of Flamingo, I counted, through estimating in groups of 10, 39,800 combined snook and juvenile tarpon dead.
But widespread death did not stop with fish.
We observed approximately 140 dead crocodiles, really large animals, some of which were 6 to 10 feet long, that had been around for a while, and they succumbed to the cold. This is also another species that had recently actually been considered a conservation success story. They had been reclassified from endangered to threatened, a great success in the endangered and threatened species world in regard to management.
What killed these animals was extreme cold temperatures not normally seen in South Florida winters. But South Florida and the Florida Keys have had these cold temperatures in previous years without the massive loss of life. So what was so unique about this cold snap? The duration. Not only was it extremely cold, it also lasted many, many days.
And we do see cold-related fish kills every couple of years, but this was a much more significant event than what we've seen in the past 30. This seemed to be maybe a 30 or 40-year event. The last time we saw an event like this was 1977. It was fairly similar to what we saw in 2010, just based on the amount of dead fish that were observed.
To document what was happening, resource managers and environmental scientists sprung into action.
So we got up in helicopters and did aerial surveys of most of the marine and estuarine areas in the park to try to better describe the extent and magnitude of the fish kill and the impacts on other wildlife.
Throughout the next few days and weeks, the dead were counted and data was analyzed. Pete Frezza documented 54 different species of marine fish that died.
Now, a fish like a snook and a bonefish and a tarpon, they begin to start losing their life functions at around 50, 52 degrees. And we had that water temperature for 4 or 5 days in a row. And when I was out there trying to document this event, that second week of January, and what you would see was the snook, they lose their equilibrium first. They can't stay upright. So they start going upside down. That's the first signs of what you see of a fish in trouble, is them starting to lose equilibrium and turning upside down. So I saw that for a couple days, about 2 days, with the snook and the juvenile tarpon before they actually died.
Fish kills and dead manatees are hard to miss. Wind and currents tend to push floating dead fish and other animals towards the shoreline where they are readily observed. However, what about those species whose impacts weren't as obvious because they took place below the surface and further from shore?
Corals really like to live in tropical water, in tropical weather, where water temperatures, they thrive in water temperatures that don't really get below in the 70s is about the coldest they like, and into the upper 80s for the warm side of things. the water temperatures, we actually saw readings that went down to as low as 48 degrees on parts of the reef. And this is very important because the corals that live here don't do well once the water temperature gets below about 52, 54 degrees. And what happens when they get exposed to real cold water is they die off.
By mid-January, there were many reports of coral bleaching, a stress response in corals normally seen in the warmest months of the year when temperatures increase. However, corals also become stressed when temperatures dip below the coral's preferred temperature threshold. Science divers from 13 different agencies responded to these reports in a 2-week monitoring effort led by the Nature Conservancy. During that time frame, divers conducted 80 surveys all the way from Key West through Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary and north through the reefs of Palm Beach County. How were they able to get these surveys done so quickly? Turns out that rapid response teams were already in place through the Nature Conservancy's Florida Reef Resilience Program that has been conducting late summer reef monitoring along the Florida Reef Tract annually since 2005. Divers discovered that many of the corals weren't just bleached, but dead from the acute stress of rapid temperature declines.
When a coral first dies off, that tissue is gone, but that coral structure is really there, and you can see all the details within the coral skeleton. Over time, over about a period of 3 months, that erodes and you no longer can see that detail within the structure of the skeleton. And that's how we can determine if it recently died or if it died longer time frame.
What Byrne and the multi-agency monitoring team discovered was that coral deaths from the cold snap were not uniformly distributed across the entire reef tract. Some colonies fared better than others, and it depended on their location. The shallow waters of Biscayne Bay and Florida Bay, as well as the nearshore patch reefs, showed the greatest coral losses, at times greater than 10%. Coral loss had everything to do with proximity to cold water pulses. In certain locations near channels, corals within 300 feet of each other experienced 10 to 15 degree temperature differences. On a positive note, the reefs found in deeper waters and those offshore were spared thanks to the warmer water influence of the Florida current.
We also had the Gulf Stream in pretty close, and that was actually over the Fore Reef, which is the main barrier reef system that is real popular with diving and all the tourists go out to. That area was buffeted by the Gulf Stream and never got the cold water affecting them, so we didn't see any effects on those sites out there. But the inshore areas, the reef areas that are real close to the islands, and those mid-channel reef areas is where the cold water came out.
Until 2010, a widespread cold water coral die-off hadn't occurred in Florida since the late 1970s. And never before has a cold water event been as well researched and documented thanks to the existing monitoring infrastructure of the Florida Reef Resilience Program. This rare cold water data allows researchers to learn more about coral responses to cold stress and provide resource managers in South Florida with information to better understand and protect these critical habitats.
So in terms of management after an event like this, of course we can't control the temperature, but we certainly can do things to protect the resources out here after we have an event like this. And the state, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, did a great job of protecting the snook. They did a detailed survey of the loss of snook, based on estimates from surveys, and realized that, yeah, hey, the numbers show what the people were seeing. The snook really took a big hit.
Snook probably took one of the hardest hits from the cold event that we had in January 2010 of all the species in the park. They're a fairly tropical species, and we had really widespread mortality as a result of the cold.
Resource managers at Everglades National Park have been meticulously collecting data from fish surveys for years. By interviewing anglers coming in from a day of fishing, they determine the catch per unit effort, which means how hard and how long are anglers' attempts to catch a specific species.
So after collecting all the information that indicated that the productivity of the fishery had dropped dramatically relative to the prior 20 years, we worked very closely with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. They are the state agency that regulates fisheries here in the state, and after working with them, sharing data with them, they made a recommendation to the commissioners in the state to keep snook harvest closed for an additional year.
South Florida, the Everglades, and the Florida Keys provide habitat to a unique mix of tropical and temperate fish species. Snook, bonefish, and tarpon like warmer tropical waters, while species such as redfish, spotted sea trout, and black drum like cooler temperate waters.
Now, if you were a snook fisherman or a bone fisherman, you would have thought this was a terrible event, and that's completely understandable. However, if you were into red fishing, this is a fantastic event. Because something very interesting, what we're seeing out here in terms of the fishing in Florida Bay, is we've seen an incredible increase in the numbers of redfish in Florida Bay, particularly juvenile redfish. There's just a mass of these small redfish came in, and don't know whether it was from, again, lack of predation or lack of competition from tropical fish species, but the redfish population here in the southern Everglades has done fantastic after this cold event.
The red fishing has been off the charts. People have been catching redfish like they've never caught before in the last 20 years, and we're so happy to see a silver lining as part of the result of the cold impact.
Another group of fish that benefited from the cold snap of 2010, native freshwater and saltwater prey fish. Monitoring indicates there was a noticeable increase in the smaller native prey fish populations that form an important link in the food chain for birds and other fish. These native prey fish have been suffering from the infiltration of non-native fish that have overtaken their habitats.
We have about 16 species of non-native fish that live in Everglades National Park and throughout the Everglades. And those fish species are typically very tropical. They come from South America and Southeast Asia, and they don't tolerate cold temperatures well.
Unlike many native fish, non-native tropical prey-based fish, like the jewel cichlid, can't survive cold weather. This was good news for South Florida's native species.
This event really turned out to benefit these native fishes because, really for two reasons. First of all, there was a release of competition with these cichlids that had become really overrun in the southern part of the Everglades. And secondly, it was a lack of predation.
The January 2010 cold snap highlighted another issue that thankfully is being addressed: the need for long-term monitoring. Pete and his team at Audubon's Tavernier Science Center were able to accurately measure the effects of fish communities because of their vast database going back 30 years.
Just a 30-year data set that we have here at Audubon, you can clearly see that the deviation or variance in temperature over the course of a year is increasing. So the cold is getting colder and the warms are getting warmer. It's absolutely true.
And what we know from working with some of the best scientists that are studying climate change and sea level rise in Florida is that we may actually be expecting more extreme temperatures, not only on the warm end, but also on the cold end. And if that's the case, there's some possibility that what we experienced in January 2010 was related to climate change, although we really can't be sure. What we can be sure of is that scientists are telling us to expect more extreme temperature swings, both on the cold end and on the warm end.
Like hurricanes and wildfires, the extreme cold experience in January 2010 was a natural event. The South Florida and Florida Keys ecosystems have evolved to tolerate conditions such as these for short periods of time. But if these recent weather events can be attributed to climate change and begin to occur more frequently, what then? Will plants and animals be able to adapt to these rapidly changing conditions?
Climates change. They're cyclic throughout the time of the Earth. We've had lots of different times where the climate has changed. What makes this time frame different than those is the time that it's taking. Normally, climates change on a geological time scale where we're talking hundreds, thousands of years for the time to change. And the systems and animals have time to adapt to that and able to still thrive and move to a different area where they can survive and live really well. But what we're seeing is that those climates are now changing on a much more rapid pace, where the animals and the ecological systems don't have time to adapt to that.
Just as a person's compromised immune system impairs their ability to fight even a small illness, so too is a stressed ecosystem less able to bounce back when faced with additional threats. Our environment's resilience and adaptability to natural stressors can be enhanced through the reductions of human-caused stressors. Such is the role of resource managers at the Environmental Protection Agency, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, and National Park Service. Through projects and regulations that address human-caused threats, such as pollution, marine debris, vessel groundings, and poaching, resource managers work toward building an environment better equipped to respond to climate changes and natural stressors. An environment that will continue to support the economy and quality of life in South Florida for ours and future generations. There are no other Everglades in the world. They have always been one of the unique regions of the Earth, remote, never wholly known. The miracle of the light pours over the green and brown expanse of sawgrass and of water, shining and slow-moving below, the grass and water. That is the meaning and the central fact of the Everglades of Florida. It is a river of grass. There's a road in South Florida that connects Miami to Tampa. Nearly 100 miles of this road between Miami and Naples was built using materials excavated during the construction of the canal that runs adjacent to the roadway. Completed in 1928, the Tamiami Trail effectively shut off the natural flow of water into Everglades National Park. At 2,400 square miles, Everglades National Park is one of the nation's largest national parks. However, the entire Everglades ecosystem was historically 4 times this size and was covered by a slow-moving sheet of water flowing from Lake Okeechobee to Florida Bay, what Marjorie Stoneman Douglas referred to as the River of Grass. In 1900, people weren't flocking to South Florida. In fact, it was still fairly remote with a population of only 50,000. The thousands and then millions more that did come over the ensuing decades demanded protection from devastating floods that accompanied the all-too-common tropical storms and hurricanes. At the same time, they also needed reliable access to fresh water during the droughts of the winter dry season. To do this, the historic Everglades was divided into a series of impoundments to conserve and store water during the dry season, as well as provide flood protection to South Florida's growing population centers. While these modifications greatly altered the natural hydrologic conditions within the wetlands, they also affected Everglades ecology.
Used to be a really broad overland sheet flow regime that extended all the way from Lake Okeechobee down all the way to the terminus of Florida in Florida Bay. It was an uninterrupted sheet flow.
When the Tamiami Trail was built, it essentially created a dam right across the middle of the Everglades ecosystem. While this hurt the Everglades, it was the building of over 1,400 miles of canals and levees that really damaged the natural ecosystem. The engineering that moves water and prevents floods now diverts about 1.7 billion gallons of fresh water to the coast each day. This water no longer flows in a slow-moving sheet across the South Florida ecosystem to Florida Bay, and evidence points to the absence of sheet flow as one reason for the disruption of plant and animal communities in the Everglades, loss of wading birds, and fewer fish and pink shrimp in Florida Bay, the Florida Keys, and the dry Tortugas. Management of the water within the Everglades to meet human needs wreaked havoc on the ecosystem. And while it caused some areas to be too dry, it caused other areas to be too wet.
In some of the areas that were not dried out, we essentially had too much water. And this, in fact, contributed to problems that we started noticing back in the 1960s as well, is we started seeing a higher increase in alligator nest flooding occurring, and the population size of alligators plummeted. We also have really good records now on some of the endangered species, such as the Cape Sable seaside sparrow, that have been dramatically affected by too little water in some areas of the Everglades and too much water in other portions of the Everglades.
Many species suffered from the change. The natural rhythm of wet and dry cycles that Everglades plants and animals evolved in over thousands of years has suddenly changed. Scientific data collected over many years were proving to officials tasked with preserving the natural ecosystem that the Everglades was in trouble. In fact, the park was first listed as a World Heritage Site in danger in 1993, in part because of the marked deterioration in water flows and water quality, resulting from agricultural and urban development.
I firmly believe that the passage of the Everglades National Park Protection and Expansion Act in 1989 was probably one of the pivotal times in Everglades restoration, because it essentially allowed for the use of all the information that had been collected prior to that date and actually come up or direct the Corps of Engineers to come up with a concrete plan that would allow for its restoration.
The 1989 Everglades National Park Protection and Expansion Act directed the National Park Service to acquire 109,000 acres in northeast Shark Slough. It also directed the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to make modifications to roads and canals to restore the natural hydrological conditions in Everglades National Park.
To date, we've